Hi, I'm Eric Sparks from OldFutures.com, and today taking a look back at the classic sci-fi movie Destination Moon. It's a movie that many of you have probably seen, some of you might not. Little background on it: it was produced by George Powell, who later produced a lot of science fiction films in the 1950s. At that time, he was relatively unknown by the general public. He had done mostly short animated films. Hadn't really made a name for himself yet. In 1950, well, a couple years before, but for 1950, he got the chance to produce Destination Moon, and in a sense ushered in the entire 1950 sci-fi craze. Afterwards, he would go on to make When Worlds Collide, War of the Worlds, Conquest of Space, The Time Machine. His name would almost become synonymous with 1950 science fiction. The film itself was really the first major science fiction film of the 1950s, and really the first U.S. film to take a serious look at what space travel might really be like. Another studio called Lippert Pictures heard about what George Powell was doing, and they rushed into production their own space sci-fi movie called Rocketship XM. Destination Moon was a big production, lots of special effects, and, you know, they were taking their time and getting things right. Rocketship XM was shot in just 18 days, was shot on black and white, just some tinted color sequences. They actually end up on Mars instead of their destination, which was the moon. Not much in the way of special effects, and they ended up getting to theaters first, and kind of stole a little bit of the press from Destination Moon, but I think in the end Destination Moon is the better film anyway. So to go to the film itself, the movie starts off with this rocket launch by General Thayer and Dr. Cargraves, two of the main characters. And you get this vague feeling, they hint that there was sabotage to the rocket, and really all that they do is show you some orange smoke coming from the top of this concrete wall. You have no idea really what it's supposed to be, and somehow the audience is supposed to know from that there's foul play. Really, they should have done something else, maybe show some shadowy figure sneaking away from a building or the rocket site, or anything really would have been more effective. But, I mean, later they talk about it, so you get the idea. After that slightly bumpy start, the movie then begins to pick up a little more. General Thayer and Dr. Cargraves approach an aircraft businessman named Jim Barnes. They convince him that they're ready for a mission to send a rocket to the moon. They convince him. He goes and convinces a bunch of other businessmen, oddly enough with the help of Woody Woodpecker, and a custom-made cartoon by Walter Lantz for this film that explains rocketry. After that, you know, they get their funding and they're off working on the ship. They do all this stuff, build the ship in the middle of the desert, and when they're almost done, the vague threats come back, people trying to stop the launch. You get the idea that it's, you know, the Nazis or the communists or something like that, you know. Anyway, you know, they say that they can't test the ship. Well, they decide, fine, we won't test the ship, we'll just go ahead and launch. So they decide to go ahead and launch. At the last second, some guy is driving up with a court order saying that they can't take off, and they just hop into the ship and go. On the way, before they leave, their radio man, Brown, gets appendicitis, and they convince his assistant, his name is Joe Sweeney, to take his place. Joe doesn't believe in the mission at all, doesn't believe the thing's even going to get off the ground. A lot of people today have serious problems with that character, because, you know, he's this, you know, random guy from Brooklyn who doesn't know anything about rockets, anything about spaceflight, doesn't understand almost anything that's going on, and has to have everything explained to him. You know, that, oh, we're in space, so you're going to float, and you can't fall off of the ship when we're flying in space, because we're all in the same orbit, and things like that. Really, you know, he never would have even gotten close to a rocket, much less, you know, been asked to go on one. So it seemed like that was a common tool for exposition in 1950s movies. You know, have somebody who doesn't understand what's going on, and then everybody else in the film has to explain it, so then the audience gets an explanation too. Might not have been the perfect way to go about it for this film, but, you know, considering it was really the first big 50s sci-fi movie, and, you know, they didn't understand, you know, audiences at that time did not understand what we understand about, you know, actual real space travel, because nobody had done it. So, I mean, I think it was needed, and it works well enough. Anyway, so they blast off, they get up into space. There was some really interesting stop-motion animation done when they have to do a spacewalk, and somebody floats off the ship, and they have to go out and get him back. Then they get ready for the landing on the moon. This was actually really tense and well done. They're getting close to their landing spot. They see that it's mountainous and they can't land there, so Barnes has to find another landing spot, and they use up a whole bunch of fuel in finding a new landing spot. Oddly enough, that was almost exactly what happened when Neil Young and Buzz Aldrin made the first landing on the moon. They go to their first landing spot, and they discover that it's basically a big field full of boulders, and if they try to land on it, there's a real good chance that they would tip over and crash. So Neil spends a whole bunch of fuel finding a new landing spot, and he ended up landing with only about 30 seconds of fuel left. So it was a little prophetic in that sense. Once they get down on the moon, they start to explore and set up science experiments and, you know, really enjoy being on the moon. They make a speech and, you know, all of the things that you would expect the first visitors to the moon to do. There's some beautiful matte paintings done by a man named Chelsea Bonestall. I think that's correct. Anyway, shortly after they get there, they realize they've got a serious problem. Barnes used up too much fuel in the landing, and they don't have enough fuel to get back. They start stripping things off of the ship, and it doesn't look like they're going to make it. Of course, they do end up getting off of the moon, but I'm not going to spoil at least that thing for you. Just watch the film and see what it is. Overall, it's a really fantastic example of 1950s sci-fi. It's definitely worth watching for any fan of classic science fiction. Absolutely a must-see in this category, and if you haven't seen it, you definitely should. It's got great special effects, a really interesting story. I mean, the characters are mostly compelling. And really, it was the first serious attempt in a U.S. film to show spaceflight and to show a flight to the moon. It's got, you know, a couple flaws here and there, but really nothing that seriously detracts from the film. And it's definitely, you know, incredibly enjoyable. I can highly recommend it, and you should definitely pick it up and watch it. For OldFutures.com, I'm Eric Sparks.